We have just witnessed the sudden death of Catherine Hughs on January the 18th, 2006, one of Walhalla's oldest citizens, and as a lot of people say, a walking history book of this particular town. Her family was the Beeman family, one of the early settlers of Walhalla, and a very prominent family who owned the hotel and general store, and was active in local politics as well as the state government. Catherine lived in the Overflow Hotel and Boarding House, which was one of the oldest buildings still intact in Walhalla. And last August, I was able to interview her in the Oconee County Library. I think you'll enjoy this interview where Catherine talks about what she remembers from her parents and grandparents about the early developments of Walhalla.
I'm Catherine Hughs. I was born in Walhalla on October 30th, 1919. My father was Wade Coke Hughs. My mother was Annie Beeman Hughs.
And your mother was related to the owner of the Beeman Hotel?
She was his granddaughter.
His granddaughter. His granddaughter. Tell us some interesting things that you can remember about the Beeman Hotel.
Well, by the time I would remember, the Beeman family didn't own it anymore. Mm-hmm. And parts of it were used as a store, and there must have been parts of it that were torn down.
They were torn down?
Parts of it.
Okay. Tell us about the house where you live now.
My house was built, Dietrich Beeman owned that whole block. Each one of the early settlers got so much property, and he owned that whole block where the house is. And I don't remember the builders, but it was built to be a boarding house.
It was built to be a boarding house.
And the first people who lived there, the Hughs from New Jersey, had come down to Walhalla, and they had a boarding house there. The Beemans lived in the hotel down on Main Street.
Oh, they lived down there.
And later, my mother's father, after the war between the states, he lost his Main Street property, and so he had to move his family to that house.
I see.
And so they lived there from that time on. Dietrich Beeman and his son did a good bit of building in Walhalla, and maybe I mentioned, after the surveyor had marked off the lots, he numbered them and just put the numbers on pieces of paper, and everybody who had paid dues into the colonization society just reached in and drew a number, and that was his lot. And so Dietrich Beeman owned down on Main Street where the hotel was, and then he drew the number for the block where I live. And my house was a two-story house, and it was built to be rented as a boarding house. The first people that lived there were the Hughs. They had come from New Jersey. And later they built in another area, and then there were some one-story houses on that block that were rental houses. I think there may have been 3 or 4. And after the war between the states, of course, people were in debt, and my mother's father had to mortgage his Main Street property, and that included the hotel and the store buildings, and then he couldn't pay off the mortgage, and so they were going to have to move. He was going to have to move his family to the house where I live now, and my mother's mother was expecting her 7th child. The 3rd little child had died as an infant, and I guess they decided they'd wait till after the baby was born before they moved. And after the baby was born, she developed an infection and died. So her sister in Charleston had 2 little boys, Miss Mertens, And she took the baby and kept her for about a year and a half. And so my mother's father had to move his family then to my house. That's where they all grew up. And he had appendicitis about 2 years after they moved there, and of course no hospitals back then, and he died. So my mother and her brothers and sisters were orphans. They had to have a guardian, of course, till all of them were grown. And in the meantime, he had been to Charleston to see the baby, and he was talking to his brother-in-law, and of course to her aunt and uncle were Mama and Papa, because she heard her little cousins call him that. And she walked up to her uncle and called him Papa, and her father was standing right there. And he said, "Just pack her things, I'll have to take her home." He said, "We'll manage some way." So he had to bring that little 2-year-old child on the train from Charleston. And so then she grew up with the others in the home also. And of course back then there were no nearby hospitals. And when he developed appendicitis, they couldn't save him. So my mother and her brothers and sisters had to have guardians till they were all of age.
Can you tell us a little bit about your family, about your, I guess you'd be your mother's family?
Well, of course, Dietrich Beeman was in the German Merchant Marines.
Yes.
And he had landed at Baltimore and Charleston.
Mm-hmm.
And then at that time when so many people were leaving Europe and coming to the United States, he decided, I guess his time for enlistment was out, so he just stayed in Charleston. Mm-hmm. And then when some of them wanted to live in the mountains, and they organized into the German Colonization Society and came to Walhalla, that's when he came. And he built the first house. It was a little log house.
He built the first house?
Very first house.
Yeah.
And it was
that up where the old where the courthouse?
No, where the Beeman Hotel later was.
Oh, the Beeman Hotel.
And I think they just moved that little house on the back of the lot. And then they built the big hotel in front. Mm-hmm. And on the hotel, next to the hotel, they had a few stores. He had a grocery store. He had a blacksmith shop. And that was at the back.
Do you think that blacksmith shop might have been owned by Mr. Yost?
Well, it could have been. But maybe it was just on Beeman's lot.
Yes, right.
And he had I guess I mentioned, he had a general store.
General store.
And he was the first senator from Oconee County, first South Carolina senator.
First South Carolina.
It was split off from Pickens District.
Yes.
And I don't remember the date. It would have been in the 1800s sometime. Yes. And of course Wade Hampton, who later was governor, the Hamptons would come up. They had a summer home up at Cashier's. Mm-hmm. And they'd come by train, and then they would always spend the night in the Beeman Hotel, and then they would hire a driver to take them up to their home, their summer. Up to Cashier's. And that's where Wade Hampton was when he was elected governor.
Oh, he was up at the home?
He was up at the home, and the message came by telegraph.
Yes.
So they went to the livery stable and got the fastest horse they had. Yeah. And a rider rode, I think he was a Crisp. He rode from Walhalla up to Cassius to tell Wade Hampton he had been elected. And he came back to town, and they had a big celebration, a big bonfire in the middle of the street. And of course, and he spent the night, I guess, at the hotel, and then the next day he went back to Columbia.
Yeah, I believe someone told me that he made his first speech from the Beeman Hotel when he got back there the next day before he went to Charleston or Columbia, wherever he went.
Yes, I understand. That's probably the way it was.
Well, that's a very good story, Catherine. That is very good. I'm glad that you included that. And the rest of the family continued to live then here in Walhalla.
Yes, and the oldest daughter, and of course they went to just the town schools. We didn't have public schools then. Miss Ida McCullough had a school, and also Miss Kate Steck had a school. And my mother's oldest sister, Kate, learned about a music school in New York. And so she went there and studied music. And then she came back and she taught music, and she also taught, they had a little school connected with the mill. They had the cotton mill then. And my mother took a business course, and she was secretary to Colonel James. He was one of the lawyers, and he was also one of the guardians for their family. And then the next sister, Gertrude, married Jess Neville. She went to Winthrop, and she got her degree, and she taught school before she was married. And then the one little child had died. Then one brother was Dietrich Reapy Beeman, and he took a business course, and he worked with the railroad also. During World War I, he was working with the railroad. And later he went to Raleigh, North Carolina, and he was a partner in the heating and plumbing business. And then Dick Beeman, he was Henry Dietrich, lived in Walhalla. He served in the Army in World War I. He was overseas. And he came back to Walhalla, and he had a gas station and a garage. And then Ida Beeman went to Lander College, and she prepared to be a teacher. And in the meantime, she met Charlie Hetrick. Now, do you have information on the Hetrick hosiery mill when it was here? You don't have information. Well, the Hetricks came down from Philadelphia, I think, and they worked with Colonel James, and they started the Hetrick hosiery mill. And then during the Depression, they had financial trouble, and that mill was ended. But the Kenneth Mill took over the property and took over the building, and that's where they got their start. And we had that mill here, as well as the Victor Monaghan. That was a cotton mill. And my mother's father, I believe, bought some stock in that mill, and when they made the first cloth, he told them he wanted some of that cloth. And he had a seamstress to make shirts for his little boys. And they had a meeting of some of the directors of the mill, and he brought his little boys so they could see some garments that had been made from the cloth.
And what was the attitude of the people who founded Walhalla?
They just were willing to work hard and do it and build a town. And of course, Walhalla was already here when the war between the states started. And that would have been, of course, the South was a defeated nation. And so that would have affected them. I guess that's how it must have been followed by a depression. And that was when my mother's father lost so much of his property. He also owned out in what they call the Tan Yard. That's out in, I think, the QE area now. They had a lumber mill out there, and they would bring the lumber into town on wagons and then load it on the Blue Ridge Railroad to ship it out. And for a long time, the Beeman family owned some farmland. They rented it out for farmland. And my mother sold hers, but some of the members of the family still own some of the property. I think probably Henry Beeman may still own some out there. And the Nevilles, I think, her sister, my mother's sister Gertrude, married Jess Neville. And it's very possible that they still own some property out there in that area.
What makes Walhalla unique among the little towns in this area?
Well, I suppose the mountain climate, the location of it, and of course Highlands, North Carolina, has been noted for being a resort, especially for the summertime. And of course, a lot of the people were farmers. You know, Walhalla was sort of a rural community. And then the different businesses that came in, like the lumber business and the mills. But I guess originally it was more or less rural.
Catherine, tell us about the naming of the streets.
Catherine Street. Now, Catherine Street is named for Miss Dietrich Beeman. And there's also a little street named Dietrich. And some of the streets are named for the people. We have John Street and Ann Street. That was one of the couples. We have a Balknight Street. Well, just if you read the list of the streets, a good many of them are named for people.
What about any festivals that they had here in town in the early days?
Well, they would have in the summertime, usually because of cold winters, most of the festivals would be in the summer. And the Lutherans would always have a lawn party. And then, of course, when we were celebrating anniversary, they called it the semi-centennial, which would be 1900, wouldn't it? That was a big event. They had floats, horse-drawn floats, because there weren't many cars there then. And then, of course, in 1950, we had our 100th anniversary.
Do you remember the 100th anniversary? It was in 1953.
Very well.
Very
yes.
well.
We participated in floats and parades and exhibits at that time. And some of the people from Charleston came for that. Well, in fact, some came in when would the semi-centennial be? 1900? Yes.
Yeah, it was 1900, and then 1953 for the 100th year of Walhalla.
Of Walhalla.
And then 1976 for the 200th anniversary of the country.
And then the county, Oconee County.
Yes, right.
And, of course, Oconee was part of Pickens District at first. And I don't remember, well, I guess around, I don't remember the exact date.
It was 1850, I think 1858.
That they split off from Pickens District and formed Oconee County.
And Walhalla is a very unusual name for a town. What can you tell us about the origin of the name?
I know when I went to Winthrop College as a student, we would introduce ourselves, to the students. And we'd tell where we were from. And so many of them were from either Spartanburg, or Orangeburg, or Greenville, or Somerville. And when I'd say Walhalla, they'd say, where did anybody get a name like that for a town? So I'd explain to them the origin of Walhalla. And of course Seneca now, I believe Seneca and Oconee, are they supposed to be Indian names?
Oconee is an Indian name. Seneca, there was a famous Indian by the name of Seneca, but there was also a Roman by the name of Seneca, I think also.
In Westminster, I don't know the connection. They have an Abbey Street in Westminster, and I don't know whether that's connected to England in Westminster.
Westminster is from England, yes, yes.
Mm-hmm. And of course Salem. Now I don't know where they got the name for Salem. And of course Clemson was named for Thomas Clemson. At first it was called Fort Hill, the town. And then when they started the university, they began calling the town Clemson.
So it changed from Fort Hill to Clemson.
I think that's right.
Yeah. Catherine, tell us about when you were a little girl.
Well, all the streets weren't paved. I remember when they paved Main Street. I have some pictures of that were made before it was paved. And we had babysitters. We had young girls, the children in the neighborhood, and they would take us to walk to entertain us. And we could go to the drugstore and get an ice cream cone for a nickel. And then we'd cross the street from the stores. The stores were on one side of the street, and on the other side were houses. That was where the Wiley house was, Dr. Bell's house, and the Strother house. All that was on the other side of the street. And there was a wall out in front of the Wiley house, and so we'd walk across the street and sit there and watch the drivers. They used drag pans and mules to dig out the street. And I can see them now. They'd dig into the dirt and then take it over to the side and dump it off, and then dig some more. And now, of course, they've got tractors or bulldozers to do that kind of thing. But I can remember when they paved Main Street.
What were some of your favorite things as you were growing up in Walhalla?
Well, we had an early movie house down on Main Street. It was about in the area where the Neville Hardware store is now. And there were movies at night. Then we had matinees in the afternoon on Saturdays. And that was when they had the cowboy movies, you know. We'd go to those in the afternoon on Saturday. And we didn't have a swimming pool for a long time, a town swimming pool, and I don't remember exactly when that one was built. So we would go out to, out on the Coffee Road, there's a place called Stribning Shoals. Have you heard of that?
No.
And that's where we would go swimming. And that's where, I didn't really learn to swim, but we went out there and played. And let's see, the Brown family, I guess up at Mountain Rest, they had a big lake up there called Brown's Lake. Now, I don't have any information about that. That would be, do you know Jack Brown?
No.
Up at Mountain Rest?
Yeah.
I think his family owned that lake that called Brown's Lake. I'll have to check with Jack on that.
Well, do you remember when they still had wells?
Oh, yes. And
talk about the wells.
well, now we kept, of course, we had a well at my house before they ever had the indoor plumbing, and my mother, to conserve using town water, she would draw water out of the well to water flowers, and of course, in the early days, they had to draw water out of the well and heat big old wash pots in the yard, and they'd have to wash the clothes that way. And so that, well, I guess that's the way all laundry was done then. And of course, by the time they had indoor plumbing, they could use the water that way. And I remember, to save water, my mother would sometimes draw water out of the well to water her ferns and flowers. And that way, you see, it didn't show up on the water meter when she used it.
What about the linden trees? I think you had talked before about those. Tell us about those.
Well, of course, isn't there a famous street in Berlin called Unter den Linden?
Right.
They did. We had a linden tree in my yard, and I guess different places in town probably had them too. And finally, they made the driveway wider, so they cut the tree down. But I can remember we would play in the shade, you know, under the linden tree on a hot day.
Mm-hmm. I understand that they had linden trees in the center of Main Street, up and down Main Street.
That's probably right. And we had the two. There was kind of an island in between the two sides, you know, and if you crossed the street before we had traffic lights, if we wanted to cross from one side instead of going all the way to the end of the block, we would cross right in the middle. And so we'd go from one sidewalk to the middle section and then watch the traffic and then go from there to the other side. And so there was that little island in between the two lanes of traffic.
And what kind of traffic are we talking about?
Well, it'd be Model T Fords, and of course wagons. I don't remember seeing anybody in a buggy, but I do remember a lot of wagons.
Yeah.
And people, of course, that lived on farms, most of them had a wagon. You know, they'd bring produce into town.
You don't remember any oxen then pulling the wagons?
I'm not sure. It seems to me somebody did have, what didn't they call them, a team of oxen?
Yes.
But I don't remember who had it. But I can remember the yoke, you know, the harness. And sometimes if we had like a Christmas parade, they would look for somebody maybe that had that in a parade.
What do you know about Newberry College?
During the war between the states, the Yankees went into Newberry and took over the buildings. And the Lutherans were worried. They said, what can we do now about our college? And Dietrich Beeman was in the state senate at that time. And he told them, he said, well, I have a lot in Walhalla you can have. So they brought the college, and it's over there where the Civic Auditorium is now. And I imagine they were wooden buildings, but they built, well, maybe 2 or 3. So, and I don't remember how many years it was here. Dr. Smeltzer, I think, was probably president of Newberry, but I'd have to check on that. And of course, after the war was over, Newberry wanted them back. So they moved the Newberry College back to Newberry, and then Adja College was started on that spot, and I believe that was more or less Presbyterian. Mm-hmm. And the buildings were just wooden, and I think 2 of the buildings burned. And of course, there was a big depression after the war between the states, and so Adja College then went broke. And so that was the end of Adja, and then I don't know how it began, how it became the public school. And the present building, I think, was finished maybe in 1914. I'm not sure about that. And I have a picture of the building before they built the other wing on it. It has just one wing and then a center area. So actually, Dietrich Beeman gave that lot to start with. He was the first owner of that lot. And then the building next to that's torn down now, I think, was built in 1925. And I was in first grade at that time, and during recess, they were working on the brick masons and carpenters. And of course, the little boys would walk across the street to watch them building. And we came in from recess one day, and the teacher said, now, children, the carpenters have told us to tell the children not to cross the street, stay on this side, because they might drop a brick or a tool if somebody's standing out there. And that's how I remember when that building was started. And then they had the first old gymnasium. That must have been built, in the early 1940s. And at one time, we thought that was all the buildings we'd ever need, and now I don't even know where all the school buildings are.
Tell us about the Kiwi Courier newspaper.
I don't know who actually started. Mr. Dick Steck was editor, and at one time my father was one of the stockholders in the Courier. And at one time, I think on the above the headline, it had Steck, Sheila, and Hughs. And Mr. Joe Sheila, was a lawyer, and he invited my father to come into his law firm as a junior partner. And I think on some of the early issues, it would have at the top of the page Steck, Sheila, and Hughs. And that's been my connection with the Kiwi Courier. And I don't remember when it was actually started, though. And I don't know who actually started it, whether it was...
So your father was a lawyer then?
Yes.
Yes.
And, well, he graduated, he stood the examination for the Citadel, and he made a high enough score, so he went to Citadel on a scholarship. And he graduated there in 1901. He majored in civil engineering. So he helped survey when they were building railroads and highways. I think he did some of the surveying for the highway to Highlands. But he'd always wanted to be a lawyer. So and he got a scholarship to go to the Citadel. At that time, each county in the state could give a scholarship. And so he got the one for Oconee County. And then he went to the University of South Carolina Law School, and he graduated there in 1907, I believe. And Mr. J.W. Sheila was one of the older lawyers, and he invited him to come into his law firm as a junior partner. And their office was above where the Kiwi Courier is. That was where their law office. Yes. Yeah, present building. And we found some of those old law books. I don't know who had them, but they're getting them for the Heritage Center here. And so Then after Mr. Sheila's death, my father's brother Harry had become a lawyer, and they were living in Plant City, Florida for a while. But then they came here, and he went into the law firm then. It was called Hughs and Hughs.
After this wonderful interview with Catherine, we were able to sit down at a table and talk with her about the photos that she had brought with her. Catherine, tell us about the wells on Main Street.
This is the well. I remember when they had that right in the middle of the street.
Oh,
They
that's
had a
the well.
shelter over
That's
it.
the well then. Okay.
And I
very
remember
good.
seeing people go in there and they'd draw a bucket of water and they had something, cups or dippers or something to drink out of.
Uh-huh.
And when Mr. Pitchford, I don't know whether the first store burned, and they built a bigger one when they rebuilt. And
That was a very fancy store.
yes,
Very fancy store.
and let's see, this would be, and of course here's the wagon and
Yeah.
horses. Somebody's on horseback there.
Okay.
All right, this was the Otto Schumacher house.
Okay.
And his wife was a sister to my mother's mother. She was Sophie Reapy from Charleston. And she was married to Myberg first. And they were living in Charleston. She had a daughter and 2 sons, I think. And he died. And in the meantime, Otto Schumacher had come over from Germany. And they met and were married. And they were living in Charleston. And my mother's father told him, he had a grocery store in Charleston, and my mother's father said, we need another grocery store in Walhalla, why don't you come up? So that's how he happened to come to Walhalla. And this was on the corner of Main and North Spring Street. And it had porches around it.
All the way
And
around.
some people called it the boathouse because old river boats on the Mississippi River had porches.
Oh,
And that's why they call it-
That's the boathouse.
That's the
Okay.
boathouse.
Okay. I
And-
remember reading about that, and I didn't exactly understand why it was a boathouse.
The boathouse, but that's the reason it resembled those old river boats.
Okay.
And,
Very good.
Now that is this one.
Okay.
And then there was another house in the middle. I don't remember who built that. Mr. Chris might have owned that house at one time. And one of his daughters married Otto Schumacher.
Yes.
And now this house, I don't know whether Colonel James built it.
But it was the James,
Jaynes, C.G.
Colonel James.
Colonel James, R.T. James. And my mother was secretary for him at that time. And this is a house that burned. Now the new one didn't have these. That's why I'm assuming this was the first one. And when they rebuilt, they built it of brick. And to make it fireproof between the walls, I don't know whether they put bricks between them, but the walls were this thick. And if a room caught on fire, they could close the door, and those bricks would contain the fire until they could get it put out.
Very good.
And
Very good.
later, I don't know what caused his financial trouble, but he had to sell it. And the Nevilles bought it, and they lived there for a good many years, and now that block of, I think a store building is there now.
Oh.
I hated to see that house come down, but they said it was
Tell
not
us about
practical.
the Beeman Hotel.
All right, this was on the
On Main
corner
Street.
on Main Street with the corner of Catherine. Catherine ran right beside it.
Uh-huh.
And for her, the Catherine Street becomes the Pickens Highway, this big street. And for Dietrich Beeman, just a little insignificant street somewhere over, I've forgotten where it is, named for him. And these were stores.
Oh,
This
those
was
were
a
the
hotel.
stores.
They
That
had
was the
a-
hotel, and the store was right next door.
Grocery store, and maybe dry goods, and see the well in
Yeah,
the middle of the
yeah.
street. Hitching post.
All right, the hitching post.
And the traveling salesman, didn't want an expensive room, and so I think the little rooms in this part of the hotel were cheaper than the others. And the people would come from Charleston in the low part of the state in the summertime for a trip to the mountains.
Okay. And we go right next to This one here then of the
They called it the Beeman Hotel bus.
right.
And they would take people to Highlands and well, I guess around the county. And I don't know what this building is. I have a faint recollection of that. Now this
That might be the stores.
could be. This is my mother's father. That's Henry Beeman, and I don't know the man there. This is my mother, Annie Beeman, and this is Gertrude. The man's holding her. That was Miss Neville. And I don't know the other people on there, but I don't know how they got up. I guess they just had to climb up. But they would take people to Highlands. I don't know how many days in the week it would drive. You know, they would drive it up there. And
Could they drive up in one day?
yes, I think so.
Uh-huh.
And I think that when the railroad was not all the way to Walhalla, I think it stopped at one time in West Union.
Yeah.
So they'd meet the train then in West Union with the bus and bring them to Walhalla.
Oh, very good. Okay. And now tell us about this
All right, that's
photo here.
Dietrich Beeman and his wife, Catherine Beeman.
Okay.
And I had a picture of him in the German Merchant Marine uniform, and I can't find that picture. I don't know what happened to him. But he would come, when he was in the German Merchant Marines, they would land in Charleston and Baltimore. And then some of them were beginning to get the idea of coming to the United States. So that's how he got introduced to the United States, being in the German Merchant Marines. And you see his fingers a little bit look like arthritis. He would handle the ropes. You know, it was a sailing ship.
Right, yeah.
And when they would handle the ropes for the sails, in real cold weather, there'd be ice on them. And my mother said that that was why some of his fingers would look like they were arthritis, you know, and from handling those frozen ropes on the ship. He went back to, he was in the United States first, and he and another man went, I believe I mentioned this, so they came back with another couple when he went to get her and bring her to Charleston. The two men roomed together and the two ladies roomed together, and my mother knew the couple, but I've forgotten their name. And he had a little store in Charleston at first, I think. And then some of the people wanted mountain property, and that's how he got in with that group.
Yeah.
And that ship was
Yeah, that's a picture of the kind of ships.
I don't know that
came
that's
over.
actually what they came on, but that was probably the kind of ship.
The kind of ship.
They wanted to be farmers because they'd been farmers in Germany.
Sure.
And that's how they advertised in the paper, and that's with Joseph Grisham. He owned the property, and they contacted him, and that's how they made a deal to start Walhalla.
Okay. Okay, and then we were talking about the railroad, so let's continue on then.
That looks like a freight train.
Coming into Walhalla.
And I don't know, he looks like he's the conductor maybe, or the fireman. And this is Mr. Jess Neville standing by the road, by the engine.
Okay, very good. And what do we have here?
All right, now that's the freight depot. That was on the other side. The little passenger depot was up this way a little more, and that's where they would load and unload the freight.
Okay, very good. Okay, we did that one, and we did that one. And I don't know if we can we zoom in on this particular
The
one?
Kaufman Opera House.
Yeah, we want to be sure to get the Kaufman Opera House here.
That was used for entertainments, I think, and maybe, did I say a school? It seems to me they used that building at one time for a school.
Mm-hmm.
And of course, Mr. Kaufman was one of the early builders of Walhalla.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Okay. And what do we have here? Another street scene with...
Yes, the Wagner Monument was down there. They moved it, you know, way up to West End, because they thought it was a traffic hazard down there. But that was the street. I'm trying to think what the street was, where it was. Well, that was near the Schumacher. See, this is the Schumacher house, and Colonel James's house is back in here.
Okay.
And
So it gives us an idea of where it's located.
I'm trying to think of the street name. Catherine is below Catherine. And then, of course, I don't think we have a picture of the Confederate monument.
No, I don't believe we do.
And that was up at College Street, right in the middle of College Street in Maine. Now, this tells about him when he was in the Senate, the first state senator.
These are what?
Now, these are the Reepies.
The Reese's.
No, Riepe, R-I-E-P-P-E, and they were in Charleston. They both came from Germany. I think I had a list of where they came from. I don't see it. These were the parents of my mother's mother.
Oh, okay.
And they stayed in Charleston. And one daughter was, she was married to a Myberg first. I think I pointed her picture out. And after his death, she married the Schumacher. Now, you know some of the Schumachers.
Yes.
Well, this would be their great-grandparents. And that's where the Reepe name comes from. He was Frederick William Reepe. And she was Anna Schumacher. She was a Schumacher before she married, and she was distantly related. I mean, some of them are double first cousins, I think, through that. But that's who these people are. And their home was on 58 George Street. And they were charter members of St. Matthew's Lutheran Church in Charleston, if you've heard of that church.
Yes.
And they lived, I think their home was near that.
Yeah. Okay, I think I have a picture of their home here.
And they were across from the old Citadel. You know, the Citadel was located in one area, and then later they built farther up to a new location. I think I mentioned my father graduated in 1901 at the Citadel.
Now, what you tell me about this?
All right, that's 58 George Street. That's 58 George Street in Charleston. And that's where my great-grandfather Reepe had a store here. And I think he had a grist mill. I don't know where that was. But probably the children were born there. They had the 3 daughters, I think, and they lost only son. And this is still there. I think they made it into a museum.
Oh,
and we were glad they kept the house. I remember visiting there.
Okay.
Now this is this porch. Well, one of the houses right in here.
Yeah.
All right. This is Henry Beeman, Otto Schumacher. And this is the grandmother. She was on a visit, I guess, maybe, I don't know whether he had died or whether she just came up for a visit, because her 2 daughters was Sophie and Catherine. Now, this sister stayed in Charleston. She was Miss Merton. She was Annie Merton's. So she's holding her own oldest child. She had just 2 boys. And her Myberg husband died, and Otto Schumacher had come over from Germany, and they met, and they were married. Now, the Mybergs and all these were Lutherans, members of the Lutheran Church. Her first family, this was Annie Myberg, and she married a cousin of the Beemans, Fred Beeman. Then Hampton Myberg. You know some of the Mybergs, maybe.
No, I don't know that.
You don't know them in the Lutheran Church. All right, this is Hampton. Then she had one named Tom and one, let me see, Willie and Harry Myberg, I think. One of the other boys is not in the picture. I don't know where he could be, but anyway, these were her first family. Then when she married Otto Schumacher, this is Otto. And he has a tricycle. My mother said he had the first tricycle in Walhalla. Yeah. Now, if you know, who are some of the Schumachers in the Lutheran Church now? Craig. Probably that would probably be his descendant. And this is my mother, Annie. This is Katie. She married Sidney Adams. Later they moved to Rock Hill. This is Gertrude. She married Jess Neville. And this is Reepe Beeman. His name was Dietrich Reepe Beeman. 3 German names for the 2 grandfathers. And then she's holding, let's see, this is Rip, he settled in Raleigh. And then this is Dick. You know some of the Beemans.
Yeah, right.
That's Dick Beeman. And then she had Ida, another girl, after this child. And let's see, this is Bertha Schumacher. She's the second family. And did I mention this with his tricycle?
Yes, yeah, you mentioned that.
And I hated to see that house torn down. It was interesting.
Yeah.
Miss Phillips owned it last, I think, and she had a boarding house there. People would, especially in the summertime, would come there. And I'm trying to think what store is there now. Well, my mother's father and grandfather, Dietrich Beeman and Son, did a lot of building. And on the block where I live, this was only a two-story house. Others were just one story. And the first people that lived in that house were the Terhunes. They had come from New Jersey. Mr. Terhune needed the mountain climate. And later they bought a lot on the next block and built a house. And I think the next family were the Penningtons. I don't know anything about them, lived there. Then when the Big Depression came and Mama's father lost his Main Street property, he had to move his family. He had to ask the people living there to let him have the house. And so he had to move his family there. And my mother's mother knew they were going to have to move, but she was expecting her youngest child, and they decided to wait till after the baby was born before they moved, but she developed a fever and died, so she never did get to live there. And so then my mother's father added an extra wing to the house. He added a breakfast room and a kitchen and a laundry room. That's on the back part. And of course, they just had fireplaces to start with. And Rippy Beeman in Raleigh came down and he sent his workers and they installed a furnace. I remember when that was done in the 1920s sometime. And but that was a boarding house at first, and after they lost the property on Main Street, some people still call that the Beeman Hotel. And some of them would come back to visit. They'd say, we wanted to stay at Beeman Hotel, and of course they didn't have it on Main Street anymore.
Okay, well, since we're here and everything, this is the Valhalla, original Valhalla Memorial in Germany.
Oh.
Yeah.
Well,
this is near Regensburg.
Good.
Yeah.
I didn't know. I didn't realize it was a Valhalla, Germany.
It was built by King Ludwig's father, I believe it was.
Oh.
And inside is over 100 famous German people or German mythological characters.
Oh, all right. And of course, Valhalla and Wagner's operas.
Right.
Yeah.
The
Valhalla and the gods and goddesses. Now, some people said that's pagan. Said don't emphasize that.
Yeah. This is and it's built on the model of the Parthenon.
Oh yeah.
In Athens, Greece.
Oh, that's beautiful. I didn't know about that. Maybe I'd heard there was a Valhalla in Germany. I don't know. Well, you know, they used to preach in German, at the Lutheran Church. And then I don't know whether he would preach the same sermon, then do it in English, or whether he would alternate the different Sundays. And I have the German hymn book, my mother's German hymn book, you know, and the German Bible. I've got Dietrich Beeman's German Bible. And somebody said that when some of the settlers would come, they learned English. They'd put an English Bible next to a German Bible and read it, and that helped them translate. And then somebody was smart to think of that. I never could roll my tongue for some of the... I have an anglicized pronunciation of German. This was, I think you gave me maybe a small copy, but somebody enlarged this for me, and I had to write this. I like to get this print. Somebody made copies. I didn't get that line, but I think that print's so pretty.
It is, yeah.
And so I had to fill in what was up here. It didn't quite get that in on that, but this is, I don't don't know what. Oh, wait, it says 18. No, that's when it was started,
this is,
1848.
yeah. But this one here was,
I don't know
this
who
was as of March 1890, after a lot of it had been built up.
Right,
And shows the layout of the town, shows the north and south Broad Street, the main street, and the railroad coming into the town. And I wanted to get a picture of that just for the record. And I'm glad that you brought this along, Catherine.
This was the way I understood about the North and South Broad. You see, here's Maine. And this is the north side of Maine. This is the south side of Maine. But they run east and west. That's how we have a west-south broad and a west-north broad, east-north broad.
See, here we got Kappelman's.
Yeah, Kappelman. Now, they were...
And there was Beeman's land.
Beeman's land.
And
Bullwinkle.
Toady.
Oh, yeah.
Toady.
Crisp and Garner. I don't know some of these. Bullwinkle. You know, they call that Bullwinkle Hill down behind the Methodist Church.
Was that what you were talking about, Bullwinkle?
Bullwinkle. I think that's where it is.
Must have been. He must have lived over there then, Bullwinkle. That since he had the land there, I guess.
I would think so. Named the street.
His land was.
In John Street, there was a couple. Maybe John and Ann. We've got a John Street and an Ann Street, and I think that was a couple, but I don't know their last name. Spring, I guess there must have been a spring along there. And Church Street, that would be the Lutheran Church, wouldn't it?
Yes. Yes.
And Kappelman. Now, the Kappelmans, some Kappelman married into the Mertens family. We were related distantly to some of the Kappelmans. Van Hodel, now, I don't know anything about him, and that's, let's see, what is that one? I can't. Van Delken. Oh, Van Delken. Yeah, sometimes they combine it. And Cobb's land. Now, I don't know anything about Cobb.
Well, we still have some Cobbs in the church and everything.
Oh.
Yeah.
Yeah, I'd forgotten that.
Yeah.
But I remember Bullwinkle Hill. And now, you see, this was a Tehune boarding house. Now, that was my house at one time, in the Kaufman Opera House. I don't know whether they really had real operas or just they thought that was entertainment, so they just named it the Kaufman Opera House. I don't know.
Very good. Very good.
I hope I haven't rambled too much, but
You've rambled just right.
I usually
You're supposed to ramble.